Thank you very much. I really appreciate your being here today. So I guess I'm the only live speaker. This is great. After I bore myself to death, after 2 minutes, I'll be able to lie down on the table and take a nap. It's really great. I don't see Sam very often, which is unfortunate for me anyway. But whenever I do, I have to correct him about something. And sadly, today is no exception, Sam. The argument that the environmental left is trying to protect us from ourselves, if I could be my most subtle, is a lot of hooey, please. They're basically, the political imperative is really quite straightforward. Climate policy, an effort to constrain the supply and consumption of fossil fuels, basically generates a wealth transfer enormous in magnitude from Republican states to Democratic states. That's the basic politics of climate policy. We can discuss this later if you want. It's not really part of my talk. And at an ideological level, the climate movement is fundamentally anti-human and totalitarian. That's not very hard to illustrate or to justify logically. And I think that the argument that the left-wing climate environmental movement, which is essentially religious, is an attempt to save humanity from humanity's erroneous ways is not correct, even though it is fundamentally, or perhaps because it is fundamentally a religious construct. I mean, think about, I don't know why I'm talking about this today, but Sam's comment that they're trying to save us from ourselves kind of set me off a bit. I mean, think about, sorry, Sam, but you know that one of my great joys in life is beating the crap out of you. You know, the interpretation of destructive weather as the gods' punishment of men for the sins of man is ancient. And just as the pagans for thousands of years attempted to prevent destructive weather by worshiping golden idols, so do modern left-wing environmentalists now attempt to prevent destructive weather by bowing down before recycling bins. And that's what's going on. Well, you laugh. You know, think about the basic theological underpinnings of modern apocalyptic environmentalism. In the beginning, Earth was the Garden of Eden, but mankind, having consumed the forbidden fruit of the tree of technological knowledge, has despoiled it. And only through repentance and economic and physical suffering can we return to the loving embrace of Mother Gaia. That is modern left-wing apocalyptic environmentalism in a nutshell. And Sam, I really am quite sorry, but the argument that the Sierra Club and all the rest are trying to save us from ourselves is really quite precisely wrong. And so, anyway, fine. And now that I've gotten my beat up on Sam, you know, out of my system for the next hour and a half, well, I'll return to it this afternoon after lunch. There will be something else. Let me turn to the topic at hand. The perversities of mandated climate risk disclosures. One of the SEC commissioners is Allison Heron Lee, appointed, I guess by, was it President Obama or President Biden? I can't remember, but she's one of the Democratic SEC commissioners. She sent out a request for input about 4 months ago, asking basically the environmental left to give her the argument she wanted to promote a regulatory, a rule that the SEC, I'm sure, is going to promulgate later this year, early next year, forcing publicly traded companies to disclose, quote, their climate risks. to actual and potential investors. And so playing my usual role as the skunk at the garden party, which I've honed finely over many decades of practice, I sent in a comment as well. It was duly ignored, but I am going to summarize today what I told her in response to her request for input on this. So again, I think it's almost certain that the Securities and Exchange Commission, again later this year, early next year, is going to promulgate a rule requiring that public companies disclose their climate risks to investors, the ostensible purpose of which is to provide relevant or material information to investors so they can make choices across among alternative investments, et cetera, et cetera. That is a lot of hooey, of course. The real purpose is to force public companies to endorse the climate crisis narrative and to distort the allocation of capital away from the fossil fuel sector and related sectors in favor of economic sectors preferred by the environmental left. That's the real purpose. And also a narrower purpose, but pretty clearly very relevant, is the creation of a legal framework and a litigation framework in which again, companies are forced to sort of jump on the climate bandwagon, and in which climate changes in climate phenomena or changes in weather events are simply assumed to be anthropogenic in origin rather than natural. Pat Michaels this morning pointed out the warming between 1910 and 1945, which was, if you look at the data, which is around 3/4 of a degree, it couldn't possibly have been anthropogenic because atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases increased over that period only from about, I think, 300 parts per million up to 310. So it had to have been natural. No climate model can predict this, or does predict it. And so the environmental climate mainstream movement ignores what happens during 1910 to 1945, because if they admit that that was natural, then they would have to acknowledge that what's going on, you know, what started around 1998, all that was a strong El Nino year, through, let's say, 2002, started in the late 70s. Remember, there was the global cooling scare through the mid-70s. You all remember that, I'm sure, and then temperatures started rising until about 1998, 2002. And they would have to admit that, well, maybe that part of that's natural as well, and that's something they simply can't do. That's why the models, when you get right down to it, have two sets of variables: greenhouse gases, which have a warming effect, and aerosol sulfates, which have a cooling effect. That is basically what the climate models are. And there's really no natural forcing or radiative effects in those models. Anyway, the purpose of this rule that the SEC, I think, almost certainly is going to promulgate is to force companies to jump on the climate bandwagon and to argue that it's anthropogenic, whether they disclose it or not. It'll be inevitably a full employment act for the lawyers. Investors are going to sue. You didn't disclose this material information about this storm that hit. Why didn't you predict that? Even though those storms happen and always have happened, and whether the storms are affected by increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases is a much more dubious proposition in light of the data than a lot of people claim to admit. And it'll be a full employment act for the consultants, which I'll get to in a minute. And another purpose of this will be industrial cartelization. Inevitably, companies are going to demand that the SEC and other regulatory agencies tell them what to do and how to do it. And that will have the effect of cartelizing these industries, because all the companies will have to adhere to these regulations as a way of avoiding lawsuits and all the rest. And so it'll be sort of a safe harbor. That's the game that's being played. So the question is, are companies in a position, how am I doing? Am I okay on time here? I am, okay, good. Are companies in a position, I mean, take a big company, Exxon, whoever, General Motors, you name it, a really big company, Microsoft, are they in a position to do this kind of scientific analysis? I mean, think about the vast resources and the vast staffing needs and all the rest required to put out an IPIC assessment report every 7 years. I mean, it's just a massive effort costing hundreds of billions or millions rather of dollars at a minimum. And my claim is that regardless of whether you think this is a good idea, there is no way companies are in a position to do any of this. I mean, what assumptions should they make? Should they, I mean, if you look at the fifth assessment report that came out in 2013 or the one that's coming out now, the sixth assessment report, there are 4 scenarios of future greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. RCP's 2.5, 4.5, 6, and 8.5, or 2.6, 4.5, 6, and 8.5. And RCP 8.5 is the most extreme of the scenarios. It is almost literally impossible. The Electric Power Research Institute did an analysis of RCP 8.5 back in 2014, I think it was, and one central conclusion of which was that under RCP 8.5, the accumulation of greenhouse gases, CO2 in particular, in the atmosphere between now and the end of the century would exceed all of the known fossil fuel reserves everywhere in the world. I mean, that's how even IPIC in the sixth assessment report acknowledges that RCP 8.5 is, quote, a low probability scenario, unquote. But then they use RCP 8.5 to generate almost all of the horror stories that you've been reading about in the newspapers. That's how dishonest the IPIC process is, or it's one illustration of how dishonest the IPIC process is, and in particular the sixth assessment report. So in other words, how are companies supposed to choose among the representative concentration pathways? What should they assume about the equilibrium climate sensitivity of the troposphere? I mean, in the fifth assessment report in 2013, the IPIC range was from 1.5 degrees to 4.5 degrees. The equilibrium climate sensitivity, loosely speaking, is the temperature effect of a doubling of atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases after the climate system adjusts fully. That's basically what that means. And in the fifth assessment report, the IPIC range was 1.5 degrees to 4.5 degrees with a median of 3. In the sixth assessment report, it's 2.5 degrees to 4 degrees, so the median has moved up a little bit. In the drafts that were circulated about 2 years ago, the top of the range that the IPIC was talking about was 5.6 degrees, which is absurd, and they got so much blowback over that they lowered the top of the range down to 4. I think Pat talked about this morning, and Kevin, for those of you who were here for the previous panel, talked about what the scientific literature, the estimates of ECSR, and basically, if you look at the studies over the last 10 years, you come up with a number below 2 degrees. I mean, that's how far out of line IPIC is with the scientific literature. But the point here is that what are businesses supposed to assume when they estimate their climate risks that they're facing because of anthropogenic effects? Which climate model are they going to use? Are they going to use the Russian model, INM-CM4 or INM-CM4.8? And I think there's INM-CM5, I think, is also out there now. they're not going to use the Russian model. They'll be sued because the Russian model predicts the least amount of warming for any given increase in atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. What are they supposed to assume about natural influences, solar activity? I think somewhere on a panel today or tomorrow, someone's supposed to be talking about that. And not only do the companies have to choose among these disparate assumptions, they're gonna have to come up with projections of, quote, risks, unquote, that are disaggregated by economic sector, by geographic region, by company, over the next 100 years or more. Now, seriously? Exxon is supposed to do this in a believable way that insulates them from litigation threats and regulatory threats? I don't think this process is possible, simply as a matter of methodological feasibility. Now, about those assumptions on atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, on the sensitivity of the climate system to those increasing concentrations, et cetera, et cetera. If companies use the same or similar sets of assumptions, then they're going to wind up with more or less homogeneous predictions that are inconsistent with the historical and ongoing evidence on climate. That's why the models, on average, predict temperature trends that are at least 2 times greater than the actual record. Since the satellite data started being collected, I guess in the late 1970s. We have about 40 years of satellite data, and the weather balloon data, which are largely consistent with the satellite data, go back to the mid-50s. And so if they use the same sets of assumptions, they're going to get homogeneous predictions which are wrong. And and that's what they're going to be telling investors. And the argument that investors are going to have better information provided them by model predictions that have never been right is rather silly. If companies use different assumptions about future increases in atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, different assumptions about the sensitivity of the climate system to changes in those concentrations, then there's going to be substantial variation across companies in any given sector, and certainly across sectors, in the predictions of, quote, climate risks, unquote. And how does that sort of variation or uncertainty help investors? It doesn't. So what's a company to do? If you're a CEO of gigantic corporation X, what do you do? Well, you have a powerful incentive to conduct analyses or to buy analyses, which I'll get to in a minute, under assumptions and methodologies not that lead toward the truth, because nobody knows what that is, but instead you have powerful incentives to take actions in terms of estimating climate risks that have the effect of I just said insulting in this. It's supposed to be insulating. But okay, serendipity strikes, insulating them from adverse regulatory actions and litigation threats. Did you do something with my slides, Sam, without my knowledge? Huh? All right.
I plead the fifth.
Yeah, that's right. Trying to avoid regulatory punishments and drawn out litigation is I think we can agree, is very different from a pursuit of scientific truth, right? Science, what's that? That the CEO will have no incentive to pursue an analysis of climate risks that are consistent with the evidence. In other words, that is consistent with scientific method, proper scientific methodology. He wants to insulate his shareholders and his bonus. And I don't blame him for doing that. So that's going to be one effect, that all the analysis will be driven toward avoiding regulatory and litigation costs rather than providing information to investors about, quote, climate risks, unquote. The benefits of moderate warming, greening, if you look at the Lancet study that was published in, I guess, 2015 maybe, on a huge international study of mortality caused by cold versus heat. Far more people die of cold than heat, and so a small amount of warming is likely to reduce mortality rather than increase it. The benefits of moderate warming, agricultural productivity, and the rest are simply not going to enter this analysis. The same is true for the risks of climate policies. I mean, if you want to talk about climate risks, the risks of policies, if you look at, it's not very surprising that California now has, I guess, the second highest electricity rates in the country. I guess Connecticut is probably slightly higher than California. And what's happening in Europe is not an accident. And so the adverse effects of climate policies are part of, quote, climate risk, if you define climate risk appropriately, and that's not going to be part of this analysis either. The adverse effects of higher energy costs are part of that risk. The point is that the correct set of assumptions is not something written in stone. It's ambiguous, and only a stance of alarmism, I think, can provide a company evaluating climate risks with protection, again, from regulators and from the plaintiff's attorneys. So we now get to the issue of materiality. Current law and current SEC regulations require companies to disclose all information that is material, in other words, relevant to the decision-making by a reasonably well-informed investor. Well, public companies are required to do that and have been for many, many years. What Allison Heron-Lee, the SEC commissioner I mentioned, and the environmental left and her allies at the SEC want to do is to define, quote, climate risk, unquote, as material. Well, again, the choices among the assumptions you have to make to do the analysis of climate risks are substantially arbitrary. And so a disclosure requirement would actually weaken the materiality standard by mandating the provision to investors of massive amounts of useless information. There's a further matter, and John Cochran at Stanford has pointed this out, and quite appropriately. Climate risks are many decades, maybe even more than a century, in the future. We know what the weather is going to be like in 10 years. It's going to be pretty much what it is now, okay, with all of its variability. If to the extent that climate risk or the risk of adverse events from increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases is going to grow, a premise that is not consistent with the evidence, there's simply no evidence in terms of storms and flooding and drought and all the rest, consistent with the argument that there's a crisis, simply no evidence to support that. But to the extent that climate risks are going to increase over time with increasing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, those are many decades in the future. What's the time horizon relevant for an investor? It's probably something on the order of a decade or less. And so even if we shun aside all the other problems, climate risks from the viewpoint of an investor are really not material. And let's recognize that there are lots and lots of mass geography risks, asteroid strikes, massive volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, bioterrorism, nuclear war. I mean, there are lots of these mass geography risks, low probability catastrophes similar to an assumed catastrophic change in climate, again, for which there's no evidence. Why aren't companies being required to estimate those risks? If we're going to require companies to estimate and disclose climate risks, why not the risks of all these other low probability catastrophes? By requiring only climate risks to be disclosed and put aside again all the problems inherent in making those estimates, you wind up with capital misallocation because you're focusing on one set of risks and not other risks, which are also relevant. And despite the claims of Allison Heron Lee and the others that forcing companies to disclose climate risks will improve the allocation of capital, in fact, it'll have the reverse effect. It'll increase or result in the misallocation of capital. Am I okay on time? Good. All right. Let me now, I'm good at insulting people. What can I say? Talk a bit about the silliness of Allison Heron Lee, the honorable commissioner at the Securities and Exchange Commission. Her argument is that market forces will not lead to the disclosure of material risks because companies are competing for investments, right? They're competing for capital, and so they have an incentive in her kind of legalistic view to hide these risks from investors, because if they disclose them, investors will invest elsewhere. That's the basic argument. No, that's not true. Companies are long-lived institutions. They have powerful incentives to preserve their credibility, because not only do they want to attract capital now, they want to attract it in 10 years and 20 years and 30 years. They're long-lived institutions, and so they want to reduce the long-run cost of obtaining capital, investment capital, and so their net incentive is to be truthful, believe it or not, as counterintuitive as that may seem, by offering full and truthful information. Under what conditions do companies have an incentive to deceive? It's when they're chasing after government money. That's when they want to deceive people. I mean, think about how many of you have flown into Los Angeles or somewhere in the West and flown over the Ivanpah solar power monstrosity in the Mojave Desert? I'm sure some of you have done that. Good. I've written any number of things about Ivanpah. But the most amusing to me and my warped mind dimension of the Ivanpah campaign to get its snout into the government trough was its claim about how much capacity, electric power generating capacity, the plant was gonna offer, right? And that's based on sunlight conditions in that part of the Mojave Desert. Well, Ivanpah has been operating now for about 5 or 7 years, and as of yet, they have yet to produce anywhere near the amount of electricity that they claimed they were going to produce when they were making their pitch to the Department of Energy to get a huge grant and a huge loan guarantee. And then they subsequently applied for a grant to pay off the loans that were guaranteed already that were coming due. And when people ask them, this is a bit of a tangent, I'm sorry, but when people ask them, how come your plant is not producing as much power as you promised, their answer, I kid you not, was, well, we haven't gotten as much sunlight as we thought we were going to get when we made our plans. Now, that explanation is not quite as silly as it sounds, all right? At any given site, there's going to be an average amount of sunlight or sunlight intensity, and over time, it's going to vary. Some years are going to have more clouds and less sunlight. Some years are going to have fewer clouds and more sunlight. And their argument in the beginning, or when they made this argument that, well, sunlight conditions haven't been as strong as we anticipated, what they're really saying is, well, okay, for these first few years, we got unlucky, all right? But if you just give us enough time, over time, we'll get the sunlight on average that we claimed in the beginning, because that's just what the law of large numbers does. That is a reasonable argument. I think it's absolutely false. I think what actually happened was, when they were making their pitch to the Department of Energy in the beginning, they gave themselves the benefit of every possible doubt. And I think their assumption about the statistical distribution of sunlight conditions in the Ivanpah Valley of the Mojave Desert is simply greater than is actually the truth. And they're never going to get, on average, what they claimed in the beginning. And this is true. Think about Solyndra and Crescent Dunes and A123 systems, the Kemper plant in Mississippi, carbon capture. I mean, when you're chasing after government money, right, the incentive to lie is overwhelming, particularly if you have a senator in your corner. And I think that Allison Heron Lee has got it precisely backwards. The market has incentives to tell the truth when there's competition, and to lie or deceive or to shade things when they're dealing with a bureaucracy that is spending other people's money. All right, let's see here. All right, I mentioned the consultants earlier. So companies under this rule, which is forthcoming, are going to be required to disclose climate risks. That's going to require, as you might imagine based on the discussion already, thousands of pages of documentation with tens of thousands of pages of supporting analyses. I mean, think about the IPIC analyses in the fifth assessment report and the sixth assessment report. And the argument that 50,000 pages of material is going to provide investors with material information is a deeply, deeply dubious proposition. Inevitably, what's going to happen is there are going to be a few consulting firms that regulators will approve and that judges will accept, and that will be characterized, these firms, by the kind of the standard beltway revolving door system guy. Bureaucrats at EPA will go to these consulting firms and tell them, how to do these studies to protect the companies and earn big fees, et cetera. And I'm sure some of you know about the ESG proxy advisor process in the context of proxy proposals for public companies. Well, they're basically a cartel of two proxy advisor firms, Institutional Shareholder Services and Glass Lewis, and they're in the business of telling companies how to vote their shares when there are proxy proposals from shareholders. Well, I think you're going to wind up with a cartel of advisory firms doing these climate risk analyses for companies, and the companies, when they're sued, or if they're sued, will go into court and say, we hired the one of these two or three companies that are approved by the Environmental Protection Agency to do this, and we did due diligence, and we are immune from being sued. And so there are going to be firms required to disclose their climate risk. They're going to be driven to pay huge fees to a few companies to analyze their climate risks, again, to avoid regulatory threats and litigation. So the point here is that the effort by the SEC, now kind of the left-wing members of the SEC and their allies, I mean, it's a blatant effort to distort the allocation of capital away from sectors that are politically disfavored by ideological interest groups pursuing their agendas. I mean, you guys, I'm sure, remember Operation Choke Point in the Obama administration, which they pressured the banks not to lend to for-profit universities, and not to lend to payday lenders, and not to lend to the fossil fuel sector. And it was a blatantly unconstitutional, extra-legal effort to penalize politically disfavored sectors in favor of other sectors with no basis in law or the Constitution. Well, that's what this is going to wind up being. It's an effort to distort the allocation of capital, basically away from conventional energy. A top-down regulatory approach to evaluating risks or climate risks itself is very, very risky because you wind up with a one-size-fits-all set of assumptions and analyses that get defended ever more strongly the more incorrect they prove to be. That's simply the way the Beltway works in terms of its incentives. A bottom-up approach would be much better. You know, let the market decide what material, what information is material, and provide, in light of whatever investors demand, risk information just as they always have. And that would avoid a bottom-up approach, a competitive approach would avoid a politicization of the allocation of capital. And I think at a larger level, which is something we, all of us here, should worry about beyond sort of the policy or climate policy implications of this, we need to take steps to protect our political institutions, which requires policymaking by Congress, not by regulatory agencies simply rewriting rules to allow themselves to do what they prefer to do anyway. We need legislation rather than regulatory fiat. So thank you very much indeed. You're welcome to contact me at any time, and I appreciate Sam.